Hello, everybody. My name is Jake Doxer, and I'm the Vice President of Green Generation's Venture Arm in Washington, D.C. As someone who's very passionate about the real estate technology sector, and in particular, sustainability and climate change, it is an honor to be here today serving as the MC for today's webinar. I've known Michael Beckerman and CRE Tech team for a few years now, and a huge supporter of what they are doing, and want to thank them first for asking me and allowing me to participate today. In the future, keep an eye out for more guests, MCs like me. Hopefully they have a haircut as CRE Tech continues to support and encourage the next generation of real estate tech leaders. Today's webinar is a preview of CRE Tech's upcoming Reimagining Real Estate Sustainability Summit that runs from September 29th through October 1st, and then on October 7th and 8th. The summit is a two-part virtual event focused on the important intersection of sustainability and real estate today. Attendees will hear from leaders who are at the forefront of creating healthier and safer buildings in cities worldwide. The speakers span a wide range of stakeholders, including corporate professionals, real estate owners and operators, investors, technology companies, and government leaders. Perhaps most importantly, it will feature two of the people we'll be hearing from shortly. Lindsay Baker and Brendan Wallace are the U.S. event co-chairs for the summit, and we are very lucky to have them joining us today. Lindsay and Brendan are two of this industry's leading voices, advocating for accountability and promoting tech adoption as a primary tool for the real estate world to combat climate change, promote sustainability more generally. When we are done here today, please go online, check out the other upcoming CRE Tech events, including the one I've had circled on my calendar for months, which is the CRE Tech Match event next month. It's a revolutionary, first of its kind networking event for the real estate tech sector, taking place entirely online. Information on this and the rest of CRE Tech's extensive programming offerings can be found on their website, cretech.com/events. As much as I like to hear myself talk, it is time now for the main event. So it is now a great honor to share a Zoom with today's moderator. He's the head of industry relations at MIT's Center for Real Estate. He already has promised me a full scholarship to the Real Estate Development Master's Program, or MIT Sloan. He gave me the option, very kind. And there you go. It's been said on the internet, so it's true, and you got to stick to it. Everybody, Steve Weikal.
Jake, thank you very much, and I'll circle back on that bit of information on MIT. But hopefully you'll come get involved with us. It's a great program and a great place to be. Thank you for that introduction, and also thank you to Michael Beckerman and the CRE Tech team for organizing these sessions on sustainability. I think we can all agree, given the current state of affairs, that now more than ever our industry really needs to engage in this conversation. And to that point, I'm pleased to welcome, as Jake said, Lindsay Baker, who's a senior fellow at the Rocky Mountain Institute, also a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and she's the sustainability consultant for the CRE Tech Global Innovation Consulting practice. Lindsay and I have known one another for a long time. Good to see you again, Lindsay. And Brendan Wallace, co-founder and managing partner of Fifth Wall Ventures, also a regular presenter at CRE Tech events and throughout the industry. And I might add that both have extensive experience in innovating new and creative companies and solutions that address the pressing human challenges that we are all facing. And so it makes them ideally suited to serve as co-chairs for the US portion of the Reimagining Real Estate Sustainability Summit next week. So with that, we'll get right into it. And Lindsay, I'll start with you, and then I'll come back to Brendan. The upcoming summit is about sustainability. How do you define sustainability in your world with the things that you work on?
Well, I'll start by saying, and first of all, thanks for the great introduction, and thanks to CRE Tech for having us here. I'm super excited about the conference. I'll just say that up front. it's time. It's time for us to do this. Sustainability, my favorite definition is the old-fashioned one, the one that was created by the Brundtland Commission, not to get too historical about it, back in the 80s. But it's basically conceptually to say we need to live within the bounds of resources that we have available to us so that future generations can do the same. And that is a pretty, I would say, difficult to argue with concept about how society should play out. But we're not doing that even remotely right now. We're far, far, far from that, not to mention that we are completely unequal in the ways that those resources are allocated in the world. And so, I think many would argue that sustainability is a wonderful goal, and it's one that we're nowhere close to. But, as we know, also in real estate in particular, the whole field of sustainability has just gotten full of acronyms and concepts that are difficult to understand, and definitions of different, metrics that people argue about. So I get that the word at this point is pretty loaded for people, but it's nice to come back to conceptually what we're talking about, which is just sort of living within our means, and doing that together.
We'll come back to that because we're going to tease out a bunch of that and try to unpack it. Brendan, what's your definition of sustainability from the multiple perspectives you have in the industry?
So, in particular, we're focused uniquely on the real estate industry. That has been Fifth Wall's model since inception, is we want to encourage the industry to be more innovative, and to identify, invest in, adopt new technologies. And the interesting thing is there's a way to measure this for the real estate industry, which is true zero carbon buildings. That is what we want to get to. And I actually think the thrust of that will come through in everything we'll talk about at this conference, which is how do we get from where we are today to that end state? And there's a lot of open questions in that as it relates to ESG, as it relates to offsets, as it relates to investments in climate tech. But for the real estate industry, this is a measurable thing. It's measurable, and it actually is achievable. It just has not been achieved, and it won't be achieved on the path we're on. And to me, that excites me because it means you know what to do. The question is just, how do you get the industry to do it? So I would define sustainability as getting the real estate industry to zero carbon emissions. And that is possible in our lifetimes. And if we do that, that will profoundly impact the climate crisis in a way that I think is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because the industry, the real estate industry, has such a large effect on climate change, and most people are not aware of that.
Great, Brendan, thank you. So one version is living within your environmental means, and the other version is going to zero carbon. Both valid perspectives, clearly, and there are probably multiple other perspectives. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. There seems to be rising urgency. In fact, even at the Center for Real Estate, we've had increasing demand from our corporate partners. We recently established the Sustainable Urbanization Lab in response to that. I know you've been seeing it as well. Do you think it has staying power this time? This is not a new conversation. It's been in different versions and variations for a while. What do you think, both of you? Do you think are we going to make progress this time?
Yeah, I think we're absolutely going to make progress for a lot of reasons. One is that this is not just real estate. This is the governments of the world. This is insurance companies. This is the investor markets. This is everything. Everybody's doing this. And I think that makes it not just a trend. I'm sure that it will come and go on the conference circuit, as it always does. So I can't say that it's going to be the buzzword of every year from now to eternity. It's just going to be a shift that we go through. And I don't think we'll keep thinking of it as sort of this trend or like thing that gets written about a lot, because we're just going to be doing the work. So yeah, absolutely. I think it has staying power. But that's because I think we've reached some pretty important global tipping points that make it such that it's now or never if we're actually going to create a physical environment that our grandchildren can live in, not to mention our children.
Brendan, staying power, what's your take on this?
I think any real estate company that does not believe sustainability as a trend has staying power. is not going to be a CEO of a real estate company for much longer. This is not a fad. This is not a trend. This is not a topic of conversation in 2020 that will fade in 2021. There's an immediacy and an imminence. I'm in California right now. California is on fire. This is very real. It's tragic, it's sad, and it's long-term consequential. The other thing is that even if the real estate industry lacks an altruism about why it's important to invest in sustainability, the real estate industry itself is caught in a triangulation of forces that will compel it to embrace this. And those forces are, one, capital markets. So large capital markets investors have said that we will preferentially deploy capital, whether that's debt or equity, to low or no carbon footprint real estate. And what is real estate? It's nothing other than a cost of capital business. So when the cost of capital changes, and it is, and it's changing in favor of sustainability, the real estate industry will change. The second thing is what we've seen around regulations, right? What you've seen in New York and Los Angeles with new carbon neutrality laws is really inspiring. And more cities are about to do the same. And unlike other industries where when the local regulations change, you can move the industry to a place where there's more favorable regulations, you can't move a building. The Empire State Building is not going anywhere. It's always going to be in New York. So real estate has a permanence that makes it highly subject to local regulations, and local regulators are becoming more green and care about getting to zero carbon. And the last force is on the demand side, the demand for space. So if you are in the business of selling space, which is what real estate owners, operators, it's what they do. That is the business of real estate. It's provisioning space. If the demand for that space changes, that changes your business. And it is changing. And it's changing because these progressive tenants like Google, Amazon, Netflix, some of the biggest consumers of commercial real estate are saying, we will not lease from you. We will not demand your space if you don't adhere to these criteria. So the way I would answer your question is that it's immediate. There's an importance to it, but it's now just pragmatism. That's why I started the comment by saying any CEO in the real estate industry that is viewing sustainability as an important thing to do, as performative or decorative now, just now in 2020, because everyone's focused on it, that is a losing strategy. That is not a real estate company that will be here much longer. This is a forever change for the real estate industry, and that's a good thing.
You mentioned the mandates, fascinating article about the Scandinavian group, including PGGM, reevaluating their portfolio, and that if anything doesn't reach those thresholds and those metrics, they will reallocate their capital assignments. So I think there are other examples of that as well. We mentioned, Brendan, you mentioned going to zero carbon. What do you think the method is going to be from that? We've got examples of carbon taxes and different kinds of energy taxes in countries around the world. What would be the quickest route at this point, barring any kind of, the political challenges? And Lindsay, you can jump in on this too, because you've looked at these different schemes. What do you think on that? Is it carbon tax?
I'll let Lindsay take that, and I have a very forward answer, so I'll let Lindsay go first.
Pricing carbon and having carbon markets is certainly something that can help. There are downsides to it if it's not handled well, but so yes, I think there's an opportunity. There's a space for carbon markets, but more so ultimately, we're not just doing a market exercise here. We are actually reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and that happens through people who choose to reduce their carbon footprint in the lowest cost way possible. And that, for many real estate owners, is going to mean direct renovations to their buildings. So I would say it's sort of a threefold commitment. There's the reduction of energy consumption for your existing buildings, for your portfolio, or similarly, the new construction ones need to be very low carbon, energy footprint. There needs to be a commitment to renewable energy sources. This is one of the reasons that we're going to have to see all that natural gas infrastructure come out of the buildings in the US, because we need to be that it's a fossil fuel, it can't stay. That plus, renewable energy sources through purchasing, lots of different styles of purchasing, not just putting solar panels on your roof, of course. I think we are all past the point of understanding that that's how it's going to happen. And then the last part, which I'm really excited about, is grid responsiveness. Buildings need to be better at being participants in this increasingly complex energy system that we have. So, so that we can have fewer peaks of demand, so that we can, when the grid goes down, which will happen with wildfires and floods and all of these things, we have more resilience in our buildings so that they can continue to provide basic life support for people. So I would say it's those three areas that people should be thinking about: efficiency, renewables, and storage and grid interaction, that make all of this. If you've got strategies for all three of those, I think you're doing pretty well on getting to, taking care of the areas you need to take care of. So that's a start.
Thank you, Lindsay. Brendan, market mechanisms, regulation, or all of the above?
I agree with everything Lindsay said, and my answer would be all the above. But let's just be clear about the problem. This is a science problem. This is a science problem. It can be solved with science. We are dealing with physics right now. And how do you solve science problems? You invest in science. That is how you solve science problems. So there are two paths that you can pursue right now to get to net zero as a real estate owner. One path is what a lot of real estate companies are doing, which is they are deploying some technology. They are using some alternative energy sources. And because they can't get there fully with those investments, they buy carbon offsets. And that is useful as a temporary solution, but it's not a long-term solution. I always liken buying carbon offsets to driving around in a Hummer, right? And then buying a bunch of carbon offsets and putting a bumper sticker on the back that says net zero Hummer, right? It's not believable, it's not credible, but what it really means is that no one has invested in the science to enable you to drive a Tesla or a Prius. And that's what's not happening. And that's what we're focused on, which is, why is there an underinvestment in climate tech, right? Because today, the technology needs to be developed to cost effectively and competently enable real estate owners to get themselves to true zero carbon emissions. And those investments are not happening. And so we have a breakdown in capital markets. When you look at the entire real estate industry over the entire existence of climate tech, the real estate industry has invested less than $100 million in climate tech. That is shocking, right? That is less than 1% of Jeff Bezos's personal commitment. So just to be clear, where we are in an R&D and science hole. The real estate industry has put itself there from years of underinvestment. And now the only opportunity is to dig itself out of that hole. And the open question I think we should all be asking ourselves is, what are the market mechanisms that should be put in place to enable the real estate industry to dig itself out of this science and R&D hole that it's in? Because it's very possible. It just will only be solved with investment.
Well, your colleague Brad, my friend Brad Rywey, has said that that this tremendous amount of VC that's available recently is really the R&D for the industry. We're in an industry that hasn't typically had R&D, but I don't know that a couple of $100 million is going to do it, given it's one of the largest asset classes in the world. So how do we get there, Brendan? Just from a financing, if we all agree that we need R&D, what's the mechanism there? What's the solution there, do you think?
It's a great question. And I'm just going to tell kind of almost an allegorical, historical example of what happened in prop tech. Obviously, what is existential to why we're all here in CRE tech. When technology started to collide with the real estate industry, there was kind of two reactions from the industry. One was the put your head in the sand model, which is, I'm a real estate owner. I don't do technology. I don't invest in technology. I don't have R&D departments. I sell space. That's what I do. That, I think we all know now by 2020, that was a losing strategy. And the real estate companies that have been successful over the last decade, especially the last 5 years, are those that have reconceptualized what it means to be a real estate owner. That the line between a real estate company and a tech company is getting very blurry, and that they're becoming one and the same, and you need to invest in tech. And if you purely rely on capital markets to provide that capital to accelerate the technology you need to improve as a business, it won't accelerate fast enough. The same exact thing is happening around sustainability and real estate, which is today, the real estate industry has in fact relied on private venture capital and private equity markets to finance the technology that will enable it to get to net zero. It's not happening. That amount of money is not flowing in. And so it is incumbent on the real estate industry to, again, reconceptualize what it means to be a real estate owner, to say, I am not just in the business of investing in buildings and space. I am also in the business of investing as a business into climate tech. Why? Because the line between being a environmentalist and a sustainable organization and being a real estate company, it's no longer a hard edge. It's a very blurry edge, and it's going to get blurrier. And the same thing, I think, will happen, and that's why this conversation is so interesting and why it's so fitting that it's on CRE Tech. The same thing that happened with prop tech is about to happen with sustainability. The real estate owners that embrace that blurriness, embrace the fact that they are going to have to invest in climate tech, will be those that survive and thrive into the future, and those that put their head in the sand and say, why would I invest in this? I sell buildings, I lease buildings. That is the wrong side of history. And we are living in that history right now. And so the question you asked, Steve, about like, what is the right way forward? The right way forward is reconceptualizing for the whole real estate industry what it means to be a real estate owner and what truly committing to sustainability means. And it means investing in science and R&D and climate tech. And that's the change that we're very focused on driving.
Well, and fortunately, that's the kind of thing we do at MIT, and there are a lot of other academic institutions that are doing the work. It's a big undertaking, so I wonder if maybe we'll see some kind of a Bell Labs or some kind of other skunk works where all of the industry gets together. The way, frankly, the drug business, the car business, the hardware business, the software business, there are these consortiums. So I would hope that maybe that will be part of the mix. I guess we'll see. Lindsay, do you have some experience with that?
Well, I want to highlight what I think is another really important decision and transition that is going to happen here for real estate owners, which is, to your point, Steve, about Bell Labs. So if you imagine what it actually looked like to make a commitment to R&D and innovation at Bell, if you were the leadership of Bell and you were making that decision a certain number of years ago, what did you do to start that process? You hired smart people. You hired great technologists. You hired researchers. You hired people who knew what they were talking about. You gave them a budget and you set them out trying things and seeing what would work. And this is one of the really important things that I think is an opportunity for us in the real estate industry right now as it relates to climate change. Is what else does America need right now? Jobs. It needs jobs. And there are many, many great jobs to be had in the world of property management, facilities management, energy management, all of that stuff that is basically the stewards of our buildings. They need to be very tech savvy and they're not. So there's a huge opportunity for training there. There's a huge opportunity to get more programs to train these kinds of folks to get into real estate portfolios and start trying things. Honestly, one of the biggest problems that I had as a smart building software entrepreneur was finding people who understood what I was talking about when I was talking about software in buildings. And that's a silly and unnecessary problem to have, because it basically means we can't make that transition. So I think along with this investment to R&D, the actual dollars that have to be put to that, to some degree, it's about hiring people to get to work on those things so that we actually, as sustainability advocates, or for people who have a piece of technology, they need to have someone to pitch to at a real estate organization. So if you don't have a head of innovation, we don't even know where to go. If you don't have a head of sustainability, we don't think you have that as a priority. How are you going to make that happen? So I'd like to see that as a decision that more companies make.
Yeah.
And what Lindsay said, I think it's such an important point, because I do think all these things are tied together in a fairly virtuous circle, meaning when you have real commitments and you have real money flowing into a space, you will attract bright minds and you will attract people that truly care about this. And I think what we see too much of in the real estate industry is that a lot of the investment into sustainability programs, those are PR programs, those are communications programs. The money goes into websites and brochures and credentials that no one can verify and certifications and kind of awards that are self-awarded. There is a lot of that. And so what I've struggled with as we've looked at the real estate industry is disambiguating what is decorative and what is self-congratulatory and what is what Lindsay's talking about, attracting real minds that are science minds, that is R&D talent to help these organizations. And I think what you will see is a shift in real estate sustainability programs away from what is largely a communications and branding and PR strategy today to being more of a science and investment strategy in the future. And that is exactly what needs to happen.
And that's a great point, Brendan, and along with the financial commitment, because we know that the financial commitment without the people and the technology without the people we know that doesn't turn out well. So, but you gave me a perfect lead into a next step in this conversation about ESG and sustainability. And we know that's in the vernacular. There's a lot of conversation, not only in real estate, but throughout industry. Let's talk about company sustainability commitments and the relationship with E, S, and G. And so there are a couple of questions there. Where does sustainability, as we're talking about it right now, where does that fit into a broader ESG conversation? It's supposed to be the S.
Yeah, or no, it's supposed to be the E. It's supposed to be the E. It's the environmental. Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's supposed to be the E. It's
everyone gets that wrong, right. And that's the point. By the way.
Well, so let's clear that up a little bit as a preface to our conference next week.
Yeah.
Let's get some clarity on that.
Okay, so I know Brendan has a very good point to make on this. So I'm gonna I'll give us a preface to that. There's a few ways in which this needs to happen. I think overall, the biggest thing I have to say about ESG, sort of, markets and investing in these kinds of ratings, et cetera, is that investors are getting smarter about the question of what this nebulous ESG thing really is. So what we have seen is that people in the past have been able to get away with saying, we have a sustainability report, et cetera. And that it, kind of checks a box that relates to your ESG rating. And so then you kind of high five and go away. And I got that as a head of sustainability for a big company when we started getting ready to have an IPO, which everyone knows did not happen. We were working on this question of what our ESG rating would be. I was using it as a motivator to say, okay, well, we've got to have all of these steps. We've got to have all of this stuff in place to make sure that we're going to have a good ESG rating. But I knew in the back of my head, I was just using that as an influencer internally to get support for my programs, when the reality is that no one really has looked into it in depth before. That has changed a ton, especially in 2019 and 2020. And investors are starting to ask harder questions that will then, in fact, affect whether they invest in you or not. So I just would say, if you had an expectation or an understanding of how ESG investing and ratings and those kinds of things work, and it's not been updated in the past 6 months, then you don't understand what's going on with ESG investing, and it's time to look back at what that marketplace looks like, what that curve looks like, what investors are asking about.
As it matures, as the conversation matures. And Brendan, I'm a little concerned. I mean, I just made the mistake. I always have to remember that S is for social, not sustainability. But what if I'm really great on my E and I ignore S and G? Should that mean I should be a successful is my ESG program a success?
So maybe just backing up a little bit to deal with this question. It's an odd conflation of things, all of which are important for companies. Everyone agrees that improving businesses around E, S, and G is critical. But there's a distinction. One is that E is a physics problem. It's a science problem. S and G are not science problems, right? When you burn fossil fuels, it does something. It's measurable. Science can solve that. Science cannot solve S and G, and it won't. So there's an inherent difference in our ability to measure and improve and invest against these three very important objectives. The second thing that I think ESG has done a disservice to sustainability is that it has conflated things for all industries where the magnitudes of those things for different industries matter quite a bit. So for example, real estate is not a massive employer, but it's a massive polluter. So the E is very important in real estate. The S and G are important, but less so. And the inverse will be true of a technology company or a staffing company, right? Those are companies for whom the S and G are very important. E is also important, but less so. So conflating them confers the implication of equal weight on them for all industries. And that is why when you talk to many real estate owners about what is your sustainability program, it has always been odd to me that the conversation nebulously shifts to away from sustainability towards affordable housing and homelessness, which are very important problems, but they do not relate to sustainability, or they at least do not directly relate to sustainability. And so one thing I think that's important to do is for advocates of the real estate industry's commitment to climate change to say that it is actually a disservice, I think, to have the conversation through the construct of ESG, because there's immeasurable things and measurable things. And real estate industry is completely orders of magnitude more impactful around E than anything else in its business. And the immeasurability of S and G get lumped in with the implied immeasurability of E, which is not true. It is measurable now. So somehow I think we have to atomize ESG and dissociate these things from one another, accept that they are all important, but some are more important than others for different industries. And for real estate, it is E. E is where we turn the lever on real estate. It is not S and G. They are important and they are critical, but they are not deterministic in climate change in the same way that E is for real estate.
Wow, that was beautifully put. Thank you, Brendan, and provocative. I know we're going to drill down into all of these topics next week. One of your colleagues was interviewed, and I was not fully aware. We all hear the 40% of the world's consumption of energy by the real estate industry. I hadn't considered the 30% of total greenhouse gases and 40% of raw materials. I think I knew them, but I hadn't seen the number placed on that. So it does point to this idea that the E in our industry, we can do something about that, and it's also significant. It's huge, and we have a duty to do something about it. What do you think about? By the way, Lindsay, any further comments on that? I mean, Brendan really did a great job of.
I mean, yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a lot there, but I also will just, yeah.
Can I add one point, Steve, from what you just said? What you just said, all true stats about how impactful the real estate industry is on climate change, on consumption of resources, on energy, on CO2 emissions. That is so counterintuitive to most people. It is not something that is just obvious to the public. And so when you look at where people that genuinely care about the environment have focused, they have focused on the industries that more obviously and intuitively impact climate change. Transportation, heavy manufacturing, industrials, shipping, like that is where a lot of the focus has fallen. And so it's so interesting about real estate is that it is this culprit, probably the single biggest industry culprit that has been hiding in plain sight. And what I think is exciting, but also a huge opportunity, is that changing behavior in the real estate industry, I actually think is easier than in the transportation industry where we have to rely on consumers. And why? Because there's a smaller group of constituent actors that we have to influence. It's very hard to get everyone to want to drive an electric car. That is very hard. Or to convert from plastic straws to paper straws, or to install Nest thermostats. Those are hard problems. They relate to consumer behavior and sociology and technology and cost that are very complicated and people have worked on for years. With real estate, it's a bit more simple. We're talking about probably 500 corporations that control a significant amount of America's commercial real estate. And by regulating and taxing and providing incentives to those real estate companies to do the right thing, we can have a far more profound impact than many of the activities that have previously characterized environmental movements. And that's a huge opportunity. One that, frankly, I think is so exciting about what this conference is kind of ambitioned to do, which is this is solvable. We know who the relevant players are. They are identifiable. Many of them are Fifth Wall's LPs, and they want to do this. Many of these CEOs and real estate companies are genuinely committed to creating a more sustainable future. The question now that we get to answer, and we can answer, is how. And that's just so exciting. I think it should be exciting for everyone in the sustainability movement that we now have this gigantic lever to turn, and that is the real estate industry. And the numbers are big. They're 30%, 40%, and 40%. They're huge.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lindsay?
Yeah, I guess I just want to add one thing. I think part of what I agree, this is a very straightforward, very concentrated opportunity of a group of people to make a set of decisions that will change the world. It's like just so close you can taste it, right? It's like, it's there. I think the hardest part is getting rid of these ideas of whose responsibility it is or who exactly makes which decision. You know, when you're talking about raw materials, one of the things real estate decision makers will often say is like, oh, well, the subs buy those things, you know? Or in the case of tenants and split incentives, we get a lot of that. And I think that is definitely one of the reasons that we haven't moved faster. But for better or for worse, the planet doesn't care whose responsibility it is in your supply chain to care about it. And ultimately, for a lot of real estate companies, they are in a position to use their buying power to make these decisions. They are in a position to make changes in their lease agreements. They are in absolutely enough power. They have enough power to make these decisions. And as an industry, we're going to do that together. So there are, you know, manufacturers, architects, service providers, everyone is in on the same thing. Everyone's trying to get to the same goals. I think part of the issue is we've tended to kind of like point at the other guy and say it's his decision to make. And we don't have time for that. And it's kind of silly at this point to do it that way. So, you know, I think it should be easy, and it would be easier if we thought about it from the perspective of the planet instead of the perspective of our narrow sort of like, what hat do we wear?
And also, Lindsay, it's a great point you brought up about supply chains, because again, this is solvable. This is not an impossible problem to solve. The problem of tracking your supply chains, the consumer retail industry does this. If you look at what Kering and LVMH have done, those are far more complicated supply chains than the real estate industry. Far more complex, far more international, far more nuanced, far more just from an industrial perspective, that is about as obtuse as you can get, and they've done it. It is doable. This is achievable. And so when real estate owners say, well, of course, I get all my subcontractors, it's impossible for me to know where they're sourcing all of their materials. That is the kind of thing that in 2020, we should be saying, wrong. It's not. It just means that you haven't invested the time and attention and energy, or you haven't, as they haven't, invested in the science to do so. Like, I keep coming back to this core problem of, this is not some opaque mystery. This is a science problem. If we were investing tens of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars in solving this, which is a fraction, literally, of what the real estate industry represents, this is solvable. The real estate industry has complete agency to do all of these things. And so it's like, on the one hand, that can make you feel, oh, we're so far behind. But on the other hand, it's very empowering because, like I said, we do know what to do. We just have to figure out what are the mechanisms to encourage the industry to do it.
I wonder if one of the challenges, not to make an excuse, but one of the challenges is that we, as in the business of developers, everything's kind of project based. It gets planned, it gets built, it gets sold, it gets financed, it gets sold, and then we move on to another project. And the team often, usually, is different each time. So I agree with you completely, Brendan, that this idea that we can't understand our global network, our global supply chain network, is kind of absurd in today's world. But at the same time, it's not the same car. We're not kicking out thousands of identical cars. Each project is a little different. So do you think that adds another layer of, a different kind of layer of complexity that is certainly solvable?
Yeah, I would say it adds a different dimension of complexity. There's an idiosyncrasy to building in every market, just like there's idiosyncrasies to where you get your energy from in every market. So different places are different, right? It's kind of a very obvious truism and intuition, but nothing about that statement actually undermines the fact that it's completely knowable where you source your materials from. So I've heard that said as well, that real estate is idiosyncratic. It's different. It functions differently than other industries, all of which are true, but none of which invalidate the point that it's still totally possible and achievable to measure the carbon emissions of a building on an hourly basis, on a daily basis, on an annual basis, right? And at the same time, it's also possible to measure the embodied carbon of these assets. So I get the nuance. I just don't think it's an excuse for why we have not been able to track supply chains in the real estate industry.
Fair enough. Lindsay, you were smiling.
I mean, it's just because, you know, I guess the argument that one should not do something in business today because it is nuanced is not an argument that gets used for anything but this stuff. And that's so frustrating that that people are like, you know, like what, like, you know, think about the financial markets and how they function today. You know, do you think anyone in Wall Street was like, hey, I'm going to invent this new derivative? And someone was like, that sounds complicated. You know, like,
better not do it. Yeah.
Don't do it. You know, it's all complicated. It sort of reminds me, we've been rewatching the TV show Lost here in my home, which I don't know why, but it's what we've been watching. And there's this, you know, one of those scenes right after the plane has crashed. This is not a spoiler alert for anyone that hasn't watched Lost. A plane crashes. And all these people are on this desert island and they're trying to figure out what to do. And one of them is this particular character just kind of sitting there and being completely unhelpful. And her brother comes over and is like, hey, why aren't you being helpful? Why aren't you doing stuff? And she was like, I was just in a plane crash. And he's like, yeah, we all were. We're all in a plane crash. So like saying that you can't handle it or that it sounds a little tough is just not an excuse right now in the world we live in, you know?
Yeah.
And for the real estate industry in particular, and using this same parable of technology's collision with the real estate industry, yes, it is complicated, but everyone's dealing with the same thing, and it's been done. Real estate industry participants and CEOs that Fifth Wall would talk to. So, you know, Fifth Wall has gone on to raise, we have 1.4 billion under management. When we first started, before we had our first fund, I would sit down with real estate CEOs, and they would say it's really complicated to figure out how to integrate tech into our buildings. It's very complicated to figure out venture capital. It's very complicated to figure out access control. And that was kind of almost a reflexive response. And my retort was, yeah, that's the point. It's very complicated. But this is what the future represents for your business. And so in the same way, all of this complexity that we're kind of exploring the contours of right now around how do you measure carbon, how do you measure emissions, how do you measure offsets, do we think offsets are viable? All of those are very real, very valid, very important questions, but you have to lean into them. The answer isn't that they're confusing, so lean out. You actually have to lean into this and force the dialogue that will kind of almost extricate inaction from complexity, because those are not the same thing.
Yeah, maybe the retort should just be, that's why we make the big bucks.
Brendan, to that point, there was a question from one of our attendees asking about measuring the E on the building level, which you said this is not rocket science. This is a science problem. We can figure this out. They're saying that in their experience that at the building level, there actually are a lot of tools there. So it really does sound like it's a real estate obstacle. It's a mindset obstacle because, frankly, aside from all of the new shiny things the three of us get to look at every day, new startups and new technologies, some of that's already been with us for a while. And I don't know, Lindsay, you spent, with your experience with Comfy and Siemens, these tools are out there, but they're not being used. Is that a fair evaluation?
It is. Yeah, I mean, I would say I didn't think we would be where we are in 2020. I thought we would be further in our deploying of these kinds of things. I'm not sure if I totally understand the question that the person is asking, but I think I can get some helpful stuff framing in here. We know how to reduce energy in buildings. We know that it is a very simple problem, right? We've got fossil fuels, they get burned, they produce electricity, or they, are directly used in buildings. And we have to cut that down massively. We know how to do that, and we know how to measure it. We have energy use intensity is a very good metric for buildings, et cetera. What we have is a problem of being able to do that at scale. And that requires a certain amount of coordination on the sort of science and technology front. We have a lot of buildings that are too complicated right now to effectively and rapidly reduce their EUI. We have issues where we need R&D in the types of equipment that is not cost effective yet to get into buildings so that we can stop burning fossil fuels on site. We have, so there are a lot of opportunities to improve the technology and to deploy it faster. We know what the metrics are. We just haven't gotten there yet. I hope that helps a little bit to the.
Well, yeah, I didn't
question.
do a great job of articulating the question. Just if it is possible to measure the E, then is there a real estate obstacle? It was a statement and a question, but it does then lead me to an area that I would like to discuss is just whether we're going to call it sustainable tech or climate tech, or we're not going to call it anything, but the industry will give it a name. What are you seeing? Lindsay, you just alluded to some of the things we can't yet do, so maybe that's an opportunity for young companies. What are you seeing, Brendan? What are you seeing when when companies are coming to pitch you that you're excited about? What area in the equation is most compelling that you can talk about?
That's a tough one, and I'm being mindful of time. I could probably talk for a long time about that, but it's everything.
That's okay, we're flexible. We're flexible.
From materials tech to smart building technology, to access control, to on-site energy. There's just an enormous amount to go through. Everything is exciting. I thought what Lindsay just said, just to go back to that last question, is so interesting because one of the ways, it is totally measurable, is the first point. It is totally measurable. And I found that one of the best ways to really get to what real estate companies are doing is to ask simple questions and repeat them. So when you meet with the head of sustainability for a real estate company, you say, how much have you invested in climate tech? And you'd get a lot of hand-wavy, decorative, oftentimes performative answers. And then you ask the question again. I'm not sure I understood. How much have you invested into climate tech? And again, you'll get the same answer. And then you ask it again. And then people will talk about offsets. And then you'll ask it again. And they'll talk about deployments. And then you'll ask it again. And they'll be like, actually, we haven't done any investments in climate tech. So what's interesting is that anyone can ask these questions. Any tenant, any person can ask these questions. They're very simple. What are the emissions of your building? Tell me, like, show me the numbers. How much have you invested into this asset with respect to the technology to reduce it? Show me the number. Like, these are numerical, knowable things. And then how much have you invested into tech to take it to true carbon neutral? And you don't have to ask that many questions. You do have to repeat them quite often because there is this Byzantine maze of layers of ESG and complexity and offsets and energy purchases that you have to wade through. But people, consumers, tenants should start asking simpler questions because this is not, again, that complicated an issue at its core. How to get there is very complicated and very nuanced. But the average tenant, the average landlord, the average consumer can understand what it means for a building to be generating gigatons of carbon. You know what that looks like. That is a number. And you know what dollars look like. They have dollar signs next to them, and you can ask about them. So again, the thing I would encourage everyone to do is ask simple questions and keep repeating them. And you have to repeat them to wade through these walls of information that have been almost elaborately developed for the intent of you not knowing that information, but the number's there.
Can I just add real quick on this point about the numbers and on measurement? If you work in an organization that has not yet invested in making sure that you know how much energy you consume, if you haven't put meters and infrastructure in, two things. One is you're behind, and two is, please God, don't spend the next 2 years just measuring without reducing. Because this is not going to get you ahead in any way. Just because you don't have energy meters doesn't mean you can't start reducing energy now. It's nice to have a baseline, but that's what the rest of us have been doing for the past 20 years. So it's too late for that, I think, to sort of say like, all right, first step is we're gonna like really understand what our energy consumption is, and then in a couple of years we'll do something about it. Climate doesn't have time for that. Industry doesn't have time for that. Your investors don't have time for that. Your tenants don't have time for that. So just do it while you're also making improvements to your buildings.
And to be clear, a lot of the reason it's measured today is so that real estate owners know how many offsets to purchase, how many carbon offsets to purchase. So
Sure.
It's getting a scale to check the progress of your diet. And when you don't like the number that it generates because you're not losing the weight that you wanted to, you put one foot on the ground. And you're like, oh, I lost 20 pounds. You didn't lose 20 pounds. You just put your foot on the ground. So when real estate owners say, oh, I generated this much in emissions, and now we've reduced that dramatically, we should all applaud the fact that they are buying offsets. That is a good thing. It's just not a sustainable solution. It is the equivalent of putting your foot on the ground. So we need to encourage a kind of empiricism, but an accountability that has been absent. And I keep coming back to this is not rocket science. It's something the average consumer can understand. And that's the way to frame it.
I like the analogy, Brendan, or it's like hiring somebody else to go to the gym for you so that you can declare that your weight is lower. So,
or it's like in that example of the Hummer, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Having a Hummer and saying, actually, I'm taking carbon out of the environment because I purchased twice the amount of carbon offsets. You didn't.
And Brendan, to your point, if you're measuring, just to stay with this topic, if you're already measuring so that you can weigh how many offsets to buy, why in the hell wouldn't you also do something to, you already know the number, why wouldn't you do something to lower your number? That seems obvious.
Here's why. Because it's hard. That's hard. Investing in science is hard. And the great news is that the real estate industry doesn't have to do it. They just need to provide the money to do it. There are brilliant minds, the minds that Lindsay was talking about, talented, ambitious, socially minded, environmentally minded entrepreneurs out there that want to solve the real estate industry's problem. The real estate industry just needs to give them the money to do so. And that is historically what the real estate industry has done. But if we go by what historically the real estate industry has done, well, that has taken us to where we are right now. And that's not working, right? that has produced terrible externalities to real estate doing business as usual.
Right.
So what we need to do is say, okay, you don't need to build in-house R&D departments. You don't need to build the next glass technology internal. Silicon Valley is ready and willing to do that. The whole innovation economy is mobilized to do that for you. But you do need to commit the capital, because in committing that capital, you will reduce the cost of development of that technology. And in reducing the cost of development of that technology, you will make it more efficient for you to deploy it. And in the long run, you will actually win, but it's a long-term investment. It's not a short-term thing. It's not taking your foot and putting it on the ground on the scale. It's actually committing to lose weight. That's the difference. And it's hard. That's why it's not being done.
So we talked about how to get there and some of the mechanics of how to get there, but what about actions that tenants and consumers can take? So we've actually talked a lot about valuations and pricing and the capital angle on this, but when do we rate buildings, because there's ESG ranking and evaluation in the broader industries. We don't really have that in the commercial real estate industry yet. We have LEED and the WELL standard and different measurement mechanisms. Do we think that's effective? And how do we call out companies who are climate washing or sustainability washing or whatever washing they're doing, to the earlier point?
I want to hear Lindsay's answer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have a history with these market transformation tools like LEED and WELL, and I believe in them, in their ability to kind of help, especially in design and construction, to kind of get an owner to commit to a vision and then follow through with it. And they, because that plaque means something that matters. And even when you're talking about something like GRES and reporting to GRES and all of these other kinds of, sustainability, ESG reporting frameworks that you can report to, they are great because they force an annual commitment to do something, or in the case of design construction, just to follow through, right, on something you wanted to do, because things get stressful, budgets get cut, and it's been a tool for people. I think we're approaching a time when those are not sufficient to get us to where we need to be. We've talked a lot in this hour about the fact that cities are going to regulate this. Insurance companies are going to require it. Investors are requiring it. One of my favorite stories I heard recently was someone in a real estate firm talking about how they talked with their Dutch investors about the fact that they were committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. And their Dutch investors kind of laughed at them and said, that's when the whole electricity grid will have already, it's essentially like all the countries of the world have agreed to do it by then. So you're basically saying we'll be carbon neutral when the electricity supply to our buildings is carbon neutral. It's like, you basically just said you're not going to do anything.
It's a bit absurd, right?
It's totally absurd. And people need to know that the markets aren't going to take that as an answer anymore. So if you want to show that you're actually a part of climate, then you have to know that you have to essentially be ready to commit to something more aggressive than that. Mm-hmm. And tenants are going to ask you to commit to something more aggressive than that now. Carbon neutrality is something, I think, definition-wise, is always going to be under debate. But if I were a tenant and I were looking at what I wanted to demand from my landlord, I would probably be looking for them to have made a science-based target commitment, because it is a legitimate commitment that companies make all over the world. Many, many, many companies have made it. Not very many real estate companies have made it, but many companies have said, we have a commitment to specifically climate change. And it's in that science-based target initiative that you can look up. It's a rigorous system. So that's what I would do.
Brendan, how do we get beyond the plaque on the front door?
It's a great question. We're trying to
there's the property level, then there's the portfolio level, and then there's the company level. So we're talking about different levels of accountability.
So I know Lindsay and I are both working on this in different ways. the way we're focusing on it is through what we know best, technology, right? And technology investment. Fifth Wall is the largest and the most active investor in real estate technology. We have 60 of the world's largest real estate owner, operator, developers in every asset class from now 14 different countries. So I think we're in a unique position to do this. I think what the answer lies in is in building a consortium. No individual real estate company acting on its own will solve this. This is inherently, definitionally, this is a collective action problem, and it requires a collective action solution. And so in some ways, the fact that we're talking about how to ask the hard questions and the right questions to real estate owners is part of it. But part of it is to give them an alternative, something easy that lets them continue to do what they're doing, but invest in the right things. And so I actually think it's something closer to like a pledge, where we ask the real estate industry to say, you generate this much revenue every year. You generate this much profit every year. And if you invest in climate tech with some portion of that in some kind of pledge, that's accountable. And you are relying on the innovation economy and the brilliant minds that Lindsay was talking about to create the technology that will ultimately help you, so that it's not in 2050 when you're carbon neutral. It's not in 2050, it's in 2030. So I think a lot of it lies in building something that the real estate industry can say yes to. I don't think that real estate CEOs don't care about this issue. I think they think it's too complicated to solve on their own. And so the question is, how do we enable them to sign up, to commit to something that they don't have to do it on their own? They can do it with their peers. They can do it collectively as an industry. And to be honest, that could be a template. That could be a paradigm that we emulate in other industries. It just so happens the real estate industry is so big and so impactful and so contributive to climate change that we have to solve it for the real estate industry now. And I think that model will scale. And so honestly, that is what Fifth Wall has been focused on. Is how do we create that kind of cross-industry collaboration, building a consortium, building a pledge to truly commit to climate tech for the whole industry.
That's great, Brendan. Thank you. And I hope MIT will be part of that conversation as well. So unfortunately, we're out of time. The good thing is to everybody, next week, lots of panels, lots of continuing discussions, drilling down into all of these topics and more. So I would remind everybody to make sure to sign up for the event next week, the summit on the 29th and the 1st in the US, and also get the European perspective, which could be very interesting and informative, instructive as well on the 7th and the 8th. So I'll say thank you to both Lindsay Baker and Brendan Wallace for this really great, provocative and important conversation at a critical point in time. And I hope we get a chance to do it again. So thank you. I'll turn it back to Jake.
Thank you, Steve. I hope everyone found that to be as interesting and as informative as I did. And hope to see you all next week at the summit. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.